Record the session. Yes, the recording is on right now. Somebody did it for me. So that's done. So as I was saying, so we'll be talking about compliance and ethics. And compliance and ethics are methods, are ways of doing things. And we will be using two different sectors for that, and they're very large sectors, of course. We'll be looking at business regulations and at, more specifically, also at financial regulations. And I will probably be linking the ethical aspects to the financial regulations. I think that's an important sector, and it is an area. Finance is an area where the compliance and the ethical aspect have developed a lot. But we will be talking about business ethics. Of course, we will not be having a class on general philosophy about ethics and moral, although we will touch a bit upon those elements. But basically, it's really to see how it functions within the business sector and within companies and the organizations of companies. One of the important elements to have in mind here is that it's about how we do things in a given context that is what we call a regulatory context. And so that is why we will be we'll be starting off, obviously, on things that we call law. Okay, something that we call law, rules and regulations. And I don't know to what extent some of you have already studied law, or some law, maybe some business law, maybe some contract law, because basically if you are within the MEBF, so the Masters in Economics of Banking and Finance, it means that you probably have taken either economics or management and finance, and so you probably have touched upon some legal aspects already. But we'll have to go back on the general organizations of rules and regulations, because it is within that context that compliance as the methods to implement rules and regulation and ethics have developed. So that's the background we'll have to be looking at. The way we organize or at least I organize these seminars, that of course I'm going to make some presentation. You have PowerPoints. The class presentation are sometimes quite heavy. I mean, there's sometimes a lot of slides within each of the documents. We might not be going over them one after the other always in detail. Sometimes I'll be quicker, but at least you will have like that the documentation. You also have received normally some handouts, articles and cases that we will be looking into, and I will tell you which session that we'll be looking into them for you to prepare on those. And I will also be using sometimes short, sometimes longer online presentations, like videos mainly, TED Talks and things like that, sometimes very short, sometimes longer. We will be looking at some, for example, ethics cases, case studies, using short movies that put into play ethical related issues. So we'll be using all that, trying to make it a bit dynamic. In terms of exchange, obviously when I teach this face-to-face, it's a very interactive type of lecture. Online, it's a bit more complicated, of course. You're not always captivated by the screen, and I can understand that. But please do not hesitate. If I'm saying things that are not clear, that seem to you a bit, let's say, either not precise enough, or that you don't understand, or if you want to make a comment, please do not hesitate, either using the chat or just raising your hand. Do not hesitate to speak out. I'll be very happy to know that I have real persons that are on the other side of the screen and not just a blank screen. So please do not hesitate to tell me if you're not understanding, if you're not, and of course, if you're not hearing, if you're not seeing the documents, please make a sign like this. We can have things working on. So we'll try to keep this interactive as much as we can, although it's online. In terms of schedule, so you have the schedule. We might sometimes try to be a bit more condensed and maybe try to be a bit shorter in terms of time online, because I know, and believe me, I've been teaching online, exclusively online for more than a year now, and we all know how difficult it is to keep focused and to maintain our attention online. So although we do have those schedules that are organized, 3 hours every evening for you, which is early afternoon for me, we might sometimes try to be a bit shorter, although because I know that you are working during the day and then you have to attend the classes in the evening, so I know how it can be pretty tiring. But that we'll be doing as we go along, okay, depending on how things move. All right, so if we start moving along, first, as I said, this is just an overview of what we're going to be looking at, okay? We'll start by an explanation about rules and regulations, and that will probably take us, and I'll just check my schedule here, that will probably take us for the 2 first sessions, okay? How does the legal system function? How does it function also in a globalized economy that we have today? Now, regarding globalization, of course, there's been a lot of talks, at least in the at least for Westerners, maybe less in other parts of the world, but the Westerners have been talking about how the COVID-19 crisis and how the pandemic is going to impact globalization. And we've heard a lot of people saying, oh, but it's the end of globalization. We're going to move towards another world. Now, I find it very sympathetic, and it's very cute to think that after a crisis like that, the world will be just beautiful, everything will be fine. I think we have to be pragmatic and not lose sense of the fact that globalization will absolutely not go away. It's even probably the other way around. It will probably increase, because some of the issues that we have to face in terms of economics, or in terms of climate change and new issues, they are necessarily global in scope. So what this means is that the coming years will probably see a change of how we organize globalization. And that would be a good thing, of course, and it's also a host of new opportunities that come up, but we will not be turning our backs on globalization. So when I talk about rules and regulations and how a national system organizes internally, it's always with this global background that plays an important role, a fundamental role. And when we're looking at business and finance, obviously globalization has an impact, and a very direct impact, because we know that business and finance are highly interconnected. Okay, so the first part, focusing on rules and regulation, will both look at what is a legal system internally, what is the relationship between legal systems and development and growth, economic growth, and to what extent do we have an international legal or organization or international law that might have an impact on these issues. Okay, so that'll be the first entry point to understand then compliance and ethics. Then we'll be focusing on ethics and business ethics, see exactly how it fits in, daily business life and activities. And then we'll move towards compliance, and what I call a compliance revolution. And I'm not the only one to use that term. It has been a long and slow revolution. Although when we talk about revolution, we sometimes talk about the new compliance versus the more older compliance. But even the older compliance is not that old. And what we'll be really focusing on is how compliance that initially started basically in the banking and financial services sector, gradually in the last 10 years, 15 years, has become a fundamental method of implementing rules, regulations in any type of business. And so how compliance that was limited to one sector initially has now become a general method that we use in all industries and across economies. And what's interesting to see here is also to what extent do we have a international convergence on the role of compliance and the functions of compliance. And we'll see it's not that obvious, okay? So there'll be methods to look into, and then there will be also a conceptual framework. And that conceptual framework might differ from one country to another, but also will benefit from, let's say, transnational guidelines, or at least concepts. Then we'll finish by looking at what I call the financial and banking regulation. Actually, I should probably change this title, because what we'll be looking at is how compliance and ethics within the concept of corporate governance in the financial and banking industry has an impact. Now, I'm taking the financial and banking industry. Why? Well, because we're in the NEBF, so we are focusing on banking and financial industries, of course. But also because this is a sector that has enjoyed compliance for a longer time than others, and so that there are more things to look into. And also because of the last financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, the ethical aspects, the relationship between finance and ethics has been very important. And today, the link between ethics and corporate governance, business ethics and corporate governance, is an area of research and an area that has a large literature on the subject, obviously. And it makes sense because it is within the financial and banking industry that initially, because of some of the failings of the markets, okay, and the market failures that we witnessed in the last financial crisis that are still there, that exist, that new considerations about ethics and corporate governance have come forward. And all along, we'll look at some cases. There are some case studies that we'll have to be looking at. I'll give you some facts and different elements about compliance and of course, the ethical aspects. Now, this brings me to the, because of course this is a class, you need a grade, to the grading method. The grading method is going to be a group work, okay? So you'll have to break down in groups. We'll see later on how we organize that, but you have to break down in groups, and it will be a work done on the Enron case. And this is how we're going to organize this group work. I will give you the link to watch a movie called The Smartest Guys in the Room, which is a scenarized documentary about the failing of Enron. And it's a very interesting and very well done movie about the Enron adventure from its start, from scratch, to one of the most influenceable and one of the most, I would say, praised multinational. And it failed in a few weeks. Okay, it broke down in a few weeks. And so this failure that actually was the result of very poor corporate governance and of probably unethical behavior So that was in 2001, and you could say, and you could argue, saying, well, why would we, focus on a more than 20-year-old case? Well, because what the Enron failure has highlighted have become major concern within industries. And even if we have evolved on the different issues, it is still those issues that are at the core, at the heart of the debates about compliance and ethics in today's world. And so knowing about the Enron case is very much knowing about what all the concerns that we should have today. And so the group work will be the following. You will watch the documentary, which actually it's a, as I said, it's a scenarized documentary. Okay, so it's they tell a story. It's easy to watch, and it's actually quite nice to watch, and you learn a lot. And I will give you very specific instructions about what lessons we can actually take from that case, and that is what you will prepare. And the group work, it's not a very long document that I want you to prepare. It's something that is quite, I would say, contained, and that has to answer a set of questions that I would lay out. Okay, so that will be the only examination aspects. Okay, there will be no table exam, as we call it, or anything like that. But I'll give you more instructions. So here you have the general program of our lectures. First part on rules and regulation. How does law function, and in what context? Second part on ethics and business ethics. What is ethics? What are business ethics? Then a look at the specific method of compliance from, let's say, its inception up till now. And finally, we'll put that into the very operational context of corporate governance in the financial services in the industry. All right, and we'll be going around, looking at some cases as we go along. Now, you probably have to make an effort, but this is a bit of a, I mean, it's not a joke, but it's just to try to make sure that you feel comfortable with this class. Okay, so you probably have to make an effort. You have to be online, you have to go into some documents, and you have to tackle elements that you might not be that familiar with, corporate governance, ethics, compliance, and all that. So what I want you to have in mind are the pros and cons of making an effort. Okay, the pros and cons of making an effort. Well, the good thing about making an effort is that you feel good because you tried. Okay, so I'd like you to try, and if you feel a bit lost sometimes, do not hesitate, as I said before, and I insist on that, to shout out and give me either talk about it, ask a question, or put something in the chat. As I said, we'll try to have either written or live, or written or spoken live chat on. So that's the attitude you should try to keep in mind. Okay, the only con, so the bad thing about making an effort is that it does take effort to make an effort. Okay, but after that, you do feel better. So this is really the mind attitude I want you to have. There'll be a lot of information in this during these sessions, and I can understand that it's sometimes a bit overwhelming, but that's why I say there are pros and cons of making an effort. And anyways, at the end, never forget, I mean, we're talking about something that is professional. It's not that serious, or to say it differently, we're going to be looking at things that are very serious, but without looking at them in a serious manner. Okay, we always try to take one step back to put into context. Compliance, ethics. We're not talking about tragedy. We're talking about human interaction in a business circle. So of course we should be serious in our approaches, in our thinking, but we should not think that it's that serious. It's a death or life matter. All right. So that's the general the general approaches that I wanted to mention before we start the actual sessions, and the first session, which is about the rules and regulations explained. Also, in terms of how we're going to organize the talks, is that I'll be we'll have a pause at one point after about first hour and a half maximum, which will be more or less, if I'm correct, around the time when you might want to have something to eat, since it is the evening for you. So, first part, rules and regulations explained. If there are any questions at this point, please do not hesitate. If you want to ask questions right now, as I said, the recording is on. Okay, so the session will be on replay mode after. But if there are no questions, then rules and regulations explained. The point here is to see basically, why do we need regulations? Or why do we want regulations? And here we will see how culture does play a role. We'll be focusing on law and development. Also, when I talk about law and development, it's a very interesting approach that tries to link the relationship between two different things. One is the laws, so the institutions, the legal rules, and the actual development, growth that a country experiences. And law and development, contrary to what a lot of people thought, especially in the West for too long, was focusing on law and developing countries. And that was a mistake. Why? Because any given society at any point in history has to bring some concern to the relationship between its, what we would call its institutional or its institutional arrangement, as one famous economist used to talk about, and its development paths. To say it differently, I will show you how the concerns, the actual digging into the relationship and trying to identify the relationship between institutions, so law, and your development is of concern for any society, whether it is a developed economies, as we call it, and I rather use the term a highly industrialized economy, or whether it is an emerging one, okay? So obviously, the constraints will not be the same. The possibilities will not be the same. And the objective, the overall objective will not be the same. But the concern and the intellectual approaches can be shared, okay? So law and development helps us understand how rules and regulation function in relation to development of our societies. And when I say development, we'll see this more in detail. I'm not only and exclusively focusing on the growth of your GDP. Okay, it's not just about how my GDP increases. It's also about how my society as a whole, including economics, but including also other aspects such as freedom, education, infrastructures, etc., develops in a more or less balanced way. And all of these elements are important, as we will see. And here I'm mainly thinking about an economist, Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen is an Indian economist who also received a Nobel Prize, that focused on how development was linked to freedom. And we'll see how this concept is interesting in today's world. Then we'll take an example of international convergence of rule, what we call transnational laws, by looking at the financial regulation, because it's a good example of a sector where we see how the national level interacts very intensively with the international space or area and international law or international, let's say, groups. And we'll end by going over who are the ones that design standards and norms, whether at the national level or at the international level, because here we'll be identifying the actors of regulation, whether national actors like parliaments or professional organizations, and at the international level. And we'll see how these actually interact. First, maybe very quickly on the need, or to say it differently, the want of regulation. Why do we have regulation? Well, there's a starting point, and that starting point is quite easy to understand. We need why do we need regulations? Oops, sorry, I'm going too fast. Why do we need regulations? And that's the starting point that you have to accept, okay? We need that, first of all, for a very simple reason, is that, sorry, I got these things popping up on my screen. There we are. So the starting point, as I was saying, is that there's a need or want of regulation, and that's very true whether you're considering national markets or globalized markets. Now, the very simple explanation of the need of regulation is that otherwise we would be living in a jungle. Okay, and this has nothing to do with economics. Okay, this is just a common, let's say, psychosociological observation. Imagine playing football or rugby. I don't know if you're familiar with rugby. From where I come from, which is the south of France, we play more rugby than football. Okay, so we have this oval ball rather than the round soccer ball. Okay, but imagine playing a ball game without any rules. I do not think that the game would last more than 15-20 minutes, okay? Because all the players would be knocked out after one point. And so by taking this image, it's easy to understand why we need regulation, is that we need to organize the possibility of an exchange, of a let's say, fluid functioning of different interests. It's what the English call the level playing field. We need common rules, and that is true at the group level, at the regional level, at the state level, and at the international level. Okay. Absence of rules create chaos. And even if it doesn't create chaos, and this is where a famous economist talked about the reasons of institutional arrangement and of rules, even if it's not chaos, the possibility to exchange with a sufficient, what we would call securitization of your exchange, relies on rules. The other thing that you have to understand is that in more ancient societies, whether in Vietnam 2,000 years ago, or in Europe, or in other parts, the relationships were most heavily founded on the fact that you knew the people you were exchanging with. And of course, technology, did not facilitate traveling, but traveling was possible. So one of the reasons why there was less expansion, even of commerce, was also because it was difficult to interact with somebody that you did not know, that you had no leverage upon. And what historical works and what we call the history of economics has quite well shown, was that the possibility to expand your markets, to enter into business with people that you did not know, needed an instrument, and that instrument are rules, are regulations. Okay, I can sign a contract with a person that I do not know and feel confident, feel secured, if I know that there are rules that will enforce that contract. I can invest in a business if I know that there are rules that will protect my investment or let me benefit in return from that investment. So very basic and obvious observation explain why we need some regulations. We need rules or regulation. And here I will not distinguish. Technically we can, but I will not make a strong distinction between rules and regulation, between law and regulations, although lawyers will sometimes more technically go into the differences of these concepts. So if we want level playing field, then we need rules. Now, the problem that we will be confronted with are that legal systems, which are where you find the rules that organize the markets, that organize the interpersonal relationship, that organize contract. For example, you got the Vietnamese civil code that sets the rules for all the contracts, the basic rule of contracts. And then you have the Vietnamese financial regulation that organized the banking sector, the financial sector. And then you have the French rules, although in France, it's a bit more complicated because we have the EU and some of our rules are not national anymore, they're at the EU level. So for example, contract law in France will be given by French law. But the banking and the financial services regulation is decided at the EU level. Okay, so we have a regional integration that sometimes makes things a bit more complex, but has its advantages also. But we see, like, just by saying this, we see that the problem that immediately comes up is that legal systems are national or regional, while at the same time, we are in globalized markets. So we are in markets that interconnect. And so this raises a problem, an important problem, of how do we combine, how do we coordinate, or how do we uniform these different legal systems? To what extent are the fact that the rules are done nationally, does that have an impact on how we can obviously carry out business, knowing that business today is globalized? And so you see why I was initially saying how compliance and ethics were first really a point of attention within the financial sector. It's because historically, globalization first took off or started in the recent history, okay, so let's say in the 50 last years, in finance. It is finance that since the 1970s started to be increasingly interconnected in the world. Now, historically, if we go back 4,000, 5,000 years ago, or let's say just 2,000 to 3,000, initially, of course, it's commerce, trade that started to expand. Although some of the financial mechanisms that were invented then are still the one that we use today. But if we just take the, let's say, latest globalization of the last 50 to 60 years, that globalization first started off initially in finance. And so the concerns about this problem, national legal system, but an activity that is cross-border, has been acute much more in finance than it was in other sectors. Now, obviously today, in 2021, that question runs across all types of industries, because today globalization doesn't just mean financial globalization. It means a globalization of all our activities, okay? And with the e-economy, with the development of the internet, of live transaction online, of new services that are online, that do not need, or that need less of a physical location and a physical presence, then we see how all these elements increase in the interconnection of markets, plus the development of the e-economy with the e-commerce and all the e-services and all that, is actually challenging how we regulate all this. Because once again, for a very simple reason, the legal systems are national. And when we talk about legal systems that are national, and that creates a problem to tackle globalization, it's because you have to understand that within a legal system, you could separate three different elements: the definition of norms, which would be the content of a rule, legal tradition, and the implementation of these rules. Why do I identify these three aspects? Because each of them are not as open to international convergence or to, let's say, coordination. Definition of norms are obviously something that can more or less easily, it depends, of course, if it's a sensitive subject or not, but more or less easily can benefit from a lot of coordination at the international level. If you have forums at the international level that bring together, for example, banking specialists, they can agree on common guidelines, not identical rules, but common guidelines. The Basel Committee, for example, for banking supervision, that plays an important role today, is a good example of that. So the definition of norms can actually, although remaining national, can actually witness a convergence of the contents. And that is what we, and I'll talk more precisely about it later, that's what we talk about when we talk about transnational law. Transnational law is not a mandatory rule that would exist above the legal systems. It's just the fact that the legal systems on some subjects tend to adopt the same kind of rules. And I'll give you a very simple example. In today's world, whether you are in Vietnam, in Singapore, in Japan, in the US, in Europe, when you talk about corporate governance, you will often be talking about the same thing. Not necessarily the same content, not necessarily the same underlying philosophy, but we will be talking about the same object. When you look at how financial instrument markets, okay, the stock exchange, are organized, you realize that they're basically organized the same way, whether you're in Asia, Northern America, or in Europe. And the reason for that is very simple to I would say to identify. The reason for that is very simple. It's that financial markets are quite recent compared to the civilization that we enjoy. All right, and so financial markets are quite recent and have been regulated with a common objective to facilitate raising capital in a context that was common to the different parts of the world, which is very different from, for example, I don't know, marriage laws or inheritance law that are deeply rooted in our own and different cultures. Or to say it differently, many of the business regulation is much less, it's not cut off, that's important, but it's much less entrenched into a given culture than other aspects of regulation. So The first element, definition of norms, it can benefit from some kind of global convergence. Legal tradition is a bit more difficult. It's a bit more difficult. I'll explain and I'll show, we'll see how there are different legal traditions across the world. Some of them tend to have common grounds. Some of them are very different. But legal tradition that plays an important role is also something that evolves. If I take France, for example, it's obvious that the French legal tradition is deeply rooted in the French history. It goes all the way back to the Roman times up till now. But it is also true that this tradition evolves because society evolves. It's not, it's not written in marble. It's not a Bible. Law is something that is basically useful. It has to be useful. If rules are not useful, then you just should get rid of them because they're not helping your society. So legal tradition, of course, cannot be harmonized across the world, but we can see ways of having an exchange between those traditions. And finally, implementation, which is the enforcement of the rules. That cannot, at this point in time of our world history, that cannot be globalized. That remains national. Why? Because enforcement, what we call implementation, enforcement of rules depends on the state, on the territory of which you are going to implement the rules. And so even in an international transaction, if you need to enforce, if there's a dispute between two parties, for example, a French firm and a Vietnamese firm, well, it will be either in Vietnam or in France, depending on many factors, and that you will have to enforce, for example, the contract or a court decision. And when you're considering implementation, then even in an international transaction, you're back on a national system. You're back within the state sovereignty. And that's a challenge, for example, for the e-economy. The e-economy enables us to cross borders easily. But if there's a dispute, if there's a problem, then you have to localize your situation. So that's the starting point that you have to understand, is how these legal systems, being national, they pose a problem in a globalized world. All right. So having said this, what do we call a legal system? I'll be brief on this, just so that we're clear about what we're talking. Basically, when we talk about a legal system, we talk about something that is composed of norms, sources of these norms, or institutions, and an enforcement process. When we talk about norms, we talk about rules. And a law is a rule to be obeyed. It's a rule that I have to follow. When you're driving a car, when the light becomes red, you're supposed to stop. Okay. Now, of course, there might be different ways of driving in different parts of the world. I agree. So you see how there might be differences in the way you apply the rules. But basically, in any legal system, the norm is a rule that has to be obeyed. Now, this raises an issue because in today's world, we have a lot of what we call soft law. Okay, and here I've mentioned norms, rules to be obeyed. That is what we call hard law sometimes, compared to soft law, which is something that has become more and more important in today's world. And we will see how compliance sorry, that was a French police siren. So as I was saying, so your formal rules, your norms, what we call hard law, is basically always composed of a rules to be obeyed, which means of a content that you have to follow, and then of sanctions if you do not follow. Soft law is something that has become more and more important. And that is a bit different because it's not a rule to be obeyed in a mandatory way, but it is an incentive. It is a guideline to do things in a certain way. And when we're looking at the international level, soft law is often the only practical instrument. Why? Because you cannot force a state, or you cannot force a legal system, but you can have recommendations, guidelines. And so we will see how soft law has become an important aspect of today's world. Now, one of the problems for a business is that a soft law raises much more question about how do I implement soft law? Do I have to follow it or not? Do I need to follow it? And so we'll be looking at that, because this is where compliance plays a role. Compliance is actually a method that can link both soft law and what we call hard law or formal law. Now, your legal system, so the first level of a legal system are norms and rules. They can pursue different objectives. They can try to work as an incentive mechanism, so to incentivize people to behave in a certain way. Let's take, for example, tax law. For example, if you want to develop, if you feel like, if you want to develop I don't know, environmental friendly constructions, okay? You want buildings to be environmental friendly. Instead of fixing all the requirements for the buildings, which might be near impossible, you can just adopt, for example, tax incentives. If you build your buildings tomorrow that are more environmental friendly, then we lower the tax level. Okay, that's an incentive. Okay, those kind of things. Then rules can also work as a deterrent mechanism. Deterrence is when we try to say it simply, to frighten you from behaving in such a way. So, for example, we say that, well, if you behave in such a way, the sanction is going to be that. So by putting sanctions, and it's all the main problem is how do you proportionate the sanction to the objective, you try to deter people from acting in a certain way. For example, and I'll give you a very simple illustration. If I do not want people to engage into armed robberies, okay, because I consider that armed robberies is one of the most socially disruptive behavior. And so specifically for bank armed robberies, what will I do? I will decide that the sanction for engaging into an armed bank robbery will be the highest level, the most dramatic sanction. And the most dramatic sanction that I come up with, of course, would be the death penalty. Impossible in Europe because we have specific constitutional rights that prohibit death penalty. But let's say I can have death penalty. So I will say, well, if you engage in armed bank robbery, then the sanction is this. Now, of course, people that just maybe because they drank a bit too much to say, oh, let's go and rob a bank, they'll wake up with a headache because they drank too much and saying, oh, wait, that was a very bad idea. We're not going to do that. But professional thieves, of course, will not stop at that. So they will engage in a bank armed robbery. The consequence is that if the police arrives at that time, what will be their reaction? Well, their reaction is very simple to understand. They will start shooting immediately. Why? Because they know that they have nothing left to lose. They already risk a death penalty. So the only way out is forcefully. And so the deterrent mechanism here in this case has what we call, and it's important to understand that, it has what we call a perverse effect, okay? Because it can create a consequence that was exactly the one that the law was trying to avoid, to reduce violence in society. Why am I citing this example? Because all the deterrent mechanisms that you find in laws are very difficult to implement, to put into force, and have to be looked at very carefully because they can have a perverse effect. And we will see that in financial regulations. That can happen. Okay. And that has happened, and that still happens today. And finally, rules, they can incentivize, they can deter, or they can compensate. And this is the basic way that what we call liability rules, that's a basic way they function. A liability rule is a rule by which if you cause a damage, you have to compensate, you have to repair for that damage. Now, I want you to consider here two things when we talk about compensation. It's at the micro level, okay? If I'm responsible for damage, I don't know, I breaks somebody's object, well, I have, if I'm at fault, I have to compensate. At the micro level, the liability, what the English call tort law, is easy to understand, or what we would call also the responsibility of the firm or of the individual. But one of the new elements of debate in today's world, and that comes with ethics, and it also comes with CSR, corporate social responsibility, is the macro level compensation. How do we organize a world in where some people are losing because of the changes and others are winners? Do we not have to take into account that difference at the macro level? And do we not need rules to compensate the groups that are losing? Not because they're not at the standards, not because they're not worse, but just because of the change in context. And I'll give you a very simple example. When we have the development of the e-economy, and because that e-economy is also taking away jobs or activities in other sectors, do we not need to think about it globally at the macro level and have norms that balance out that? So when we talk about compensation, and we will see when we look at compliance and at ethics, how this understanding of compensation, the micro level, my responsibility as a firm or as a business, versus a global balancing out of compensation and compensation mechanism are two different things, but that are today important and high on the agenda of the talks that we have internationally, locally, and regionally about how we organize our rules. Second element that you have in legal systems, and I'll be very brief on that, are the sources of that legal system. And the sources, I mean, where does my rule come from? Who decides of my rule? And basically, we will see that it's either a parliament or a public authority or a judge. And we will see that how distinguishes the different legal traditions. In some legal traditions, it's the parliament that creates the rules. In other legal tradition, it's more the judge. And finally, you have the enforcement aspect. And as I said before, the enforcement aspect are obviously national, because it's linked to sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean? It means that it is only the legal public institution that have authority, and what we mean by authority here, that can use force on a given territory. And that's what we call sovereignty. It's the link between a public authority and the territory upon which it carries out its jurisdiction. And in today's world, states being sovereign, it means that no state can be forced. I mean, legally speaking, we will see that in terms of psychosociology, it's a bit more complex, of course. There can be influence, there can be a lot of elements that probably bias this approach, but enforcement is national. And to say in a much more simple way. It is only the Vietnamese judge that can sanction for the non-performance of a contract that was subject to Vietnamese law. It is only the French judge that can sanction one of the person in the contract that did not perform if that contract was subject to French law. Okay, so those are the basic elements of a legal system that we will find. And so we'll see how compliance and ethics, they play a role within that framework. They fit in within this framework. Very, very quickly, to finish off on those aspects, what we call the legal, the legal families or the legal tradition. In the Western world, there are two major legal traditions. One is what we call continental law, and that is the law. Why do we call it continental? Because it is the law, it is the methods of regulation that will be applied in continental European countries. Okay, in France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Central Europe, etc. So that is why in today's comparative law, we tend to talk about this approach as continental law. We have common roots. Within German law, in French law, in Italian law, we have common roots, and that is Roman law, the Roman law origins of our legal system. In front of that, you have what we call the common law tradition. And the common law tradition is the legal approach initially in England and Wales, and then that spread out to Australia, New Zealand, the US, etc. Why are these two traditions important in terms of model? For a very simple reason. It's because of the influence that these models have had in the past, because of the history of colonization, because the 19th century was what we call the European century. The 19th century is that part of time in history where it's Europe that dominates basically the world in terms of military power, of economics, politics, and all that. It hadn't always been the case. Before that, it used to be the Ottomans, and then there was the Asian domination. So across history, we see these dominant elements. But the latest, let's say, domination of the world of a single approach was the 19th century, and that was European. And so, of course, the consequence, and that explains it, the consequence was that many of the debates, the legal debates, have opposed two legal traditions that are European in origin and that have actually fixed the framework of the debate. Now, in today's world, things are, because of globalization, things are changing because we have a nation, a multipolar world. And so these two traditions are not the only one that can have an influence, but I would say that they have played an important intellectual role up to now. And what we are witnessing today is that we're probably gradually, but it's going to take time, moving away from a simple dichotomy, a simple opposition between continental and common law. My point of view, and what I defend, is that in today's world, we are going beyond that. And the legal mechanisms, the regulation that is gradually surfacing is something that is beyond that legal tradition. But once I've exposed very quickly the distinctive traits, you will see why there's a link between a legal tradition and culture. Why? What distinguishes the continental law approach with the common law approach? Actually, it's the role of the judge, the methods of interpretation, and the objective of the legal systems. Just one word. I'll talk about it more precisely later on with more examples, but in continental law, normally judges do not create norms. They only apply the law. It's the parliament that fixes the law. In a common law country, judges, they create laws. They create the rules, not the laws, but the rules as they give cases, as they hand down decisions. This is one of the historical main differences. The other one, very important to understand, is the objective of the legal system. In continental legal system, and I think that would be the same in Vietnam, it's the same in most of Asia, actually, and not only, but most of Asia. What is the objective of your legal system? In France, it's very clear. In France, the legal system organizes all of society, from your birth to your death, and we're talking here both of individuals or companies. The laws are here to organize society. And so that's the objective of your legal system. In a common law system, it's very different. The objective of the rules is just to put an end to a dispute. Okay? It's just to solve a conflict. So if there are no conflicts, well, that means that you do not need a rule. It means that the people, the society, is actually functioning with its own way of balancing out the contradicting interest. And you do not need a formal rule. And so in terms of mentality, these two legal traditions are very different. And those differences in mentalities still exist today in different parts of the world. Finally, the legal transplant question, and I'll be very quick on that, just one word, because we'll talk about it much more precisely in the next hour. The legal transplant question is about, to what extent can you take a legal organization from one country and replicate it into another? And for a very long time, that's what has been done. I mean, you would take corporate US law and you would say, okay, those laws seem to be efficient in the US, so I will adopt them. But it doesn't work like that. The legal transplant question is actually a very wrong question. You can look at other systems, you can understand other systems and see how you could take ideas from them, but you cannot copy and paste a legal system. Why? Because the connection of a legal system with the culture and the culture and the history is much too strong. Okay, and so that's something very important now we need to have in mind when we look at how also compliance and ethics can work, because it is not certain that an understanding of ethics in France will be the same in Vietnam or in Japan, in China, or in the US. Okay, there might be elements that correspond, that are common, and there might be differences, and so we have to understand that because we have to see how this plays out in today's world. And I'll finish. Okay, that's what I was saying about the two different legal systems. Okay, written law on the one hand, that's continental law. Case law, on the other hand, that is the common law. These differences are historical, and they were very strong historical. Both models have actually been interpenetrating each other because of, a flow of information and of a much more openness of the countries. And so both systems are in a kind of convergence today, right? So what this means basically is that in a written law system, you pay much more attention to case law, and the case law systems have a lot of written rules today. So, for example, in the UK, you have more and more written rules. In France, you give and you attach importance to case law more and more. So there's a convergence today. But there is one question that remains. It's a question of the efficiency. And for a very long time, there was a debate. And people were trying to say, well, my system is much more efficient than yours. Okay, that was basically the terms of the debate, which is a very poor way to understand it. Why? Because it is usually believed that a common law system has more adaptability. Why? Because the judge will create a rule when there's a dispute. So he will be probably much more pragmatic. Whereas there's much more certainty in the continental law system because it's a rule that is fixed for everybody, and there's a very coherent system. And it is true that the common law method probably brings in more flexibility, whereas the continental law system brings in more certainty, what we call legal certainty, whereas the common law system brings in more adaptability. The problem is, if you ask business what they need in terms of laws, they will tell you, we need certainty and adaptability. And you could replace the word adaptability with flexibility. So what is the best system today, and that is why we are living actually interesting times, is a system that would both give businesses flexibility, adaptability, and certainty. Okay, and we will see how compliance is actually probably helping that. And finally, and we'll finish, and we can have a what time is it? And we can probably have a pause after this. Oops, sorry. The efficiency gap paradox of law, and that is very important to understand because this is something that we will be going into. And actually, to be quite honest, the problems that we have that have brought forward Essex, that have brought under the limelights ethics and ethical considerations, and that have actually helped fostering and developing compliance, is, if not entirely, but is quite directly linked with what I call the efficiency gap paradox of law. What is the efficiency gap paradox of law? You really have to understand this. It's the fact that between the definition of a rule and defining a rule and applying that rule, there's a gap. I talked about the deterrence effect, that it's very difficult to actually calibrate, to balance out efficiently. That was an example. What you have to understand is that between the definition of the rule and the application of a rule, there is neither a causal nor systematic relationship. It is not because you decide that this is the rule that its application is going to be perfect and always following that rule. And so that is true to any aspect of law. It's true in contract law, it's true in business law, it's true in tax law, it's true in everything. But each time you are considering a sector that has very high collective costs in terms of failures, or that has a systemic effect, then it becomes critical. This efficiency gap paradox becomes critical. And so obviously in finance, it is the case. If your financial regulations fail, then one of the difficulties that you have is that because of the systemic input or effect of finance, then the social cost of the failure is very high, it's tremendous. Okay, and that is why the efficiency gap paradox of law, that you should always have in mind, in some cases becomes quite critical. And you see, this is also why this has actually helped bringing forward a greater concern given to ethics. Okay? Instead of having a very specific rule, you have guidelines about behavior, because you cannot come up with a very precise rule or a general enough rule to cover all the situation, or you're not certain at how this rule is going to be actually implemented by economic operators. And so you need to find other mechanisms in order to try to influence the behavior. Okay, and it all comes from this efficiency gap paradox of law. And that justifies ethics. It justifies also compliance, which is a cost-effective way, and we'll see how, a cost-effective way to put into place a numbers of regulations, okay, but in a cost-effective way, in a way that is affordable for states, because compliance rests on the activities carried out by the economic operators themselves. But all this we'll see more precisely just after. Okay, this is the first approach to the legal aspect. Now, this is, by the way, this is the part of the lecture that is probably the most abstract and conceptual. Okay, gradually we'll be becoming more and more practical with much more concrete examples. So I'm just asking you to bear with me at this point, and even starting from now on, I'll try to be probably a bit more concrete in many illustrations. And we will start that with law and development, but unless you have questions, and I'll be very happy to answer them, I suggest we have what time is it? That we have a. How much time do you need? Do you need 15 minutes? Is that okay? 15-minute pause? All right. Okay. See you in a few minutes then. Okay. Well, I hope you've had enough time to grab something to eat. Because if I'm correct, what it's 8 in Vietnam, right? It's 8, nearly 9. No, 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 nearly 8. Nearly 8. Okay, days are long for you. All right. So as I said, we'll be looking at this link between law and development. The reason why I want us to consider the relationship. Sorry, wait. I'll close the window. Otherwise, you'll have a lot of parasite noise. So the reason why I want to consider law and development, it's also for you to understand why it is important that we talk about laws and regulation, about the legal framework in the context of business, in the context of corporate governance, of financial services, in relation also with ethics. And in order for us to do that, I'd like to actually, before I even talk about this, I want to share with you a short talk. I think it's a 15 minutes talk by where is that? There. By a man called Niels Ferguson. Now, Niels Ferguson is a historian of economic thoughts. And he came up a few years ago with this analysis of what he called the 6 killer apps in terms of applications, like on like the ones you have on your cell phones. The 6 killer apps that has, at least in the past few centuries, explained the development of modern societies and of industrialized nation. And his point of view, his starting point is interesting, is trying to understand why is it that at one point in the long-term history, why is it that at one point the European or the Western approach was so successful, so efficient? And he tries to look at the different, at the macro level, the different bits and pieces that can explain that model. And he comes up with a set of explanation that actually, you will see, puts laws and regulation, or to take another term that is more often used in economics, institutional arrangements. Okay, it's a very important aspect that we're looking into. He comes up with this finding that institutional arrangement are fundamental. So my point here in letting you follow that talk, it's a YouTube talk, it's a TEDx talk, and normally I have the subtitle. It's in English, of course, and I have the subtitles. It will enable you to really understand the relevance of what we're looking into. That sometimes, maybe from the start, might seem a bit, a bit off track from your core lectures within the NEDF. So let me see if I can master this time the different options. Okay, wait. How do I set up a video? It's here, share an external video. So, Niels Ferguson. Okay. All right, so I'm going to shut down my mic. Otherwise, it has a looping effect. If you cannot hear anything, you tell me, of course. Okay, so we'll just watch this talk by Niels Ferguson, the 6 killer apps of prosperity. Remember what I said? He tries to link, to try to find a relationship between what brought prosperity over the past couple hundred, the last 2 centuries, what might explain it, and what this tells us about today and tomorrow. Again, I think it's an important aspect because this is where we stand. We stand here today, not 200 years ago. So it's not just about replicating what happened. It's about understanding what explained a certain development track and to what extent some of those explanations remain relevant, or on the other hand, might not. All right, so the 6 killer apps of prosperity by Niall Ferguson. All right. Made a mistake. All right. So I hope it was easy enough to follow. Now, this is a quite inspiring talk. There are many interesting things. There are lots of things that can be discussed and debated, of course. I don't know if you have any questions. Maybe just one word of explanation in the way Niles Ferguson was explaining things. He at one point said that the year 1776 was the most important, saw one of the most important things that happened that year was the publishing of Adam Smith's very famous book, Wealth of Nation. And everybody laughed because that same year something else happened. I don't know if you know what happened. And so it was funny to say that what was more important than that other event, it was the publishing of Wealth of Nation. See some people trying to exactly. It was it was the start of the revolution in the U.S. that that separated the colonies from the king, from the queen and the crown of England, and so that's why it was a joke, because obviously the birth of what was to become the United States of America was probably considered as more important than just the publishing of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nation, although there is a link in a certain way. There is a link, but that's why it was a joke. Now, the main interest I find in this talk, and I'd be very happy if you have questions or comments, not necessarily questions, comments. One of the main interesting point here that we have to understand is that his idea is to try to explain what created prosperity of the West, not in terms of saying that it made sense, but of explaining what are the ingredients. If we're talking about a recipe, what are the ingredients? And what I find interesting, first of all, well, actually, there are 2 points that I find very interesting. One of them is the analogy, the comparison he makes between the institutions and apps and applications. Why do I find that a pretty well-found comparison is that what he says about institutions, and that's why they're like apps, is that they're obvious to use. And once they're there, their benefit seems obvious. But behind an application, there is a code, and there is a more or less complex, usually more complex coding than anything else. And I do believe it's the same thing with institutions. The ideas might be simple. Property rights might be simple. Setting them up, having them function is much more complex. And when we talk about intellectual infrastructure, the framework that we live in, I do find the relationship to an app quite well found. It's a very, I think, illustrative comparison. So that's one thing. The fact that there are some elements of the life that we live in that seem obvious, but never forget that probably behind it is much more complex. The other element that's interesting is that in all the factors that he identifies as those killer apps, those famous 6 killer apps, all of them are more or less directly related to what you could call law, or at least to institutions. When you're talking about property right, it's obvious. But even when you're talking about medicine, about scientific research, about consumer society, you are talking about rules, about norms that are set forward within your legal systems. And so what's interesting was his approach to this development of the West and the dominance, the past dominance. Because as I told you just before, one of the interesting things of the world that we live in is that we're moving away from a single-sided dominance. Okay, that's what existed before in the past. We've had empires that have succeeded themselves, and the Roman Empire, then the Ottoman, and before that the Ottoman Empire. Those empires in themselves are not explanations. Why? Because empires, and even, to be honest, imperialism is not an invention of the West. It is something that is linked to civilizations. Okay, you go back to ancient China, and it had an empire, and it had its own imperialism. So what he is saying, and I think this is very interesting, because I think it's very true. It is not the empire model, nor is it the imperialistic model that explains the dominance. Of course, that's a consequence. Of course, obviously, once you have a given group that dominates, then he can easily have imperialistic ways of doing things. But it's the other way around. It's a consequence. It's not the cause. The cause of the development lies in those institutional arrangements. And so this does show us that in today's world, these institutional aspects are fundamental, are very important. Now, of course, the way he explains them can be debated. Why? Because obviously, today's world is also confronted with challenges that were not the ones that, for example, the Ottomans were confronted with, or after that, that the West, the European West, was confronted with. So if you think about the consequence of economic globalization, it creates new challenges. If you look, or not if you look, if you consider things like climate change or environment protection, which is a fundamental issue for the world civilization, population, and all of the cultures and all of the countries today, it is a common challenge that crosses boundaries. So the actual challenges that have to be met are within a context that cannot be compared with the past. But this idea, though, that in order to meet these challenges, some concern about the institutional arrangement are fundamental, probably remains quite relevant. So I think this is what's interesting about his talk, and it also highlights the importance of the legal aspects in those development, and also of the cultural aspects in those development. There's another point that I would just like to maybe touch a word upon, that he doesn't develop, but I find it fundamental. And I'm not saying that he doesn't talk about it because he ignores it, but because it doesn't fall in with his actual talk right now. But I think it's very important, and we have to have that in mind. It's the fact that culture plays a very important part when you're looking at institutional arrangements. Okay, and I will often talk about this in the following sessions. It's the fact that there is, with globalization, there's an illusion that can easily appear and that people tend to fall for. It's this idea that because we are interconnected, because we exchange, because people travel for education, and so they're open to other ways of doing things, to other mentalities, to other cultures, we are actually erasing the differences in culture. That would be a mistake, and I think that would be a very important mistake that we have to keep ourselves clear from and set it aside. The fact that, for example, we talk about corporate laws of course, sorry, corporate governance in most countries. The fact that open markets and some kind of capitalistic model is more or less the only model that exists today doesn't mean that culture doesn't still play a role. The capitalism that we know today is not a sole system. There are very different types of capitalism, and so their diversity remains behind this illusion of convergence. And I think it's very important to understand, because even in a very, I would say, day-to-day life in business, you are confronted with that. If you work internationally, or even if it's just regionally, you of course see those differences in the way people interact. I assume many of you are working with foreigners, and I mean by that, with people that were not born and raised or just raised in Vietnam, and so people that have a different mentality. And you're going to exchange with them technically, but you will see that they have different approaches, different ways of doing things, or even different ways of understanding the same words. And that is true, obviously, if you're working, I don't know, with a Frenchman or an American or a Russian, but it's true also if you're working with somebody from another part of Asia. Okay, Asia is not a homogeneous area. You have different cultures. Same thing for Europe. Even, you could say all people from the European Union, the French, the Germans, okay, not the English, but the French, the Germans, and the Italians, they're all the same. But they're not the same. They have different cultures. And that would be true even locally, even in a country when it's a very large country. And Vietnam is a very good example of that. I mean, Vietnam is a country that stretches for over 2,000 kilometers, meaning that from north to the south, you even have differences. Okay, and it's the same thing in France. France is a much smaller country than Vietnam in that sense. But even in the south of France, the people from the south of France and the people from the north of France have great, I would say, cultural differences. Now, of course, they speak the same language. They live within the same institutions, but they still might have some differences. Obviously, less marked than if you put a Frenchman and a Japanese together. The differences are greater, of course, but you still have these differences. So this is something he doesn't touch upon, but I think you have to keep in mind, because it has this very direct consequence to make convergence much more relative in its effect, in its real life effect, than it seems to have intellectually. Okay, we can witness great convergence technically. If you look at, for example, the regulation of finance, there is a great convergence. It doesn't mean, though, and we have to be very careful about this, it doesn't mean that we have the same way of doing things. All right, so that was the first thing. I don't know if there are any question about that, Niall Ferguson's, and I'll give you the links also, and if you want to watch this at another time to have more time to go into it. But I don't know if there might be some comments or some observation or questions or just comments. If not, I'll just move on the law and development aspects. Okay, no comment. Okay, so I'll try to be quick on this so that we can at least finish the law and development overview, and so we can then move on to the next part. So, as I told you, and I hope that now you're convinced with the fact that, yes, looking into laws and regulation is important. So coming back to this, for a long time, there was a prevailing view, a dominant understanding of things. It is what we call conventional wisdom. Now, conventional wisdom is a concept that was, I think, or at least one of the first persons to really developed this concept of conventional wisdom, I think, was Friedman, an economist who wrote extensively about the 1929 crisis. Wait, yeah, that's it. That was yeah, Milton Friedman, who tried to explain the he tried to explain why the 1929 crisis happened, and he talked about conventional wisdom. What we mean by conventional wisdom is this idea that at one moment in history, there is an understanding of things that everybody accepts, and that is very hard to debate, to question. And that's why it's conventional wisdom. And I'll give you a historical example of conventional wisdom. When Galileo first started by saying the world, that in the Western world, the world is not flat, it is round, that went against the conventional wisdom at that time that the world was flat. And then people used to believe at that time that the horizon line at the end of what you could see, once you reach that, you would fall. There'd be a big pit. And so when Galileo started saying that, he was actually accused and convicted, because it also ran against, the religious, the dominant Catholic belief at that time. That's what we call conventional wisdom. And so Milton Friedman explains the 1929 crisis, not only, but also partly because of conventional wisdom. And my point here is just to say that between institution, so law, and development, there has been a prevailing view that was conventional wisdom up till the last 10 to 15 years. What was this understanding? The understanding was the following. Rules and regulation, they foster economic activities by protecting property rights. This is one of the elements that Niall Ferguson's identify as an important application of prosperity, of development, but it's not the only one. And the prevailing view up till, let's say, at least up till the last financial crisis, was this idea that remains, I believe, partially true, is that property rights are fundamental, and that remains something that's important. But the problem was that if you had good laws and good enforcement, you would have a good economic output. And we will see that this is debatable. So it's not the importance of property rights that is debatable. That is not debatable, because it is true that if your legal system clearly allocates and protects property rights, then you can invest because you have a return on investment. What is debatable and highly questionable is the fact that you need that in order to have economic development. What is conventional wisdom, and that is finally moving away, is that having these rule of law system is a precondition to economic success. And I will show you why this doesn't resist scrutiny. I mean, if you look at how things have actually happened across time, you realize that it's much more complex. And so historically, if you look at how for the past, let's say, 500 years, things have evolved, you realize that you've had remarkable economic growth that was achieved within very different legal systems, including systems that did not live up to the rule of law ideal. Okay, and that is even true if you look, without going back 500 years ago, even if you just look at the 20th century. I mean, the way South Korea, for example, developed, it is not by creating a rule of law systems that was comparable to the one in the US or in Europe. It came to that at one point, where it came to a rule of law system, and not copying, of course, these Western systems, but it came to that because of its economic success, not as a precondition. If you take China today, China doesn't live up to the rule of law the way the West understands it, okay, in terms of accountability and things like that. These are authoritarian regimes that do have an economic development. Now, the question that comes is that sustainable over time? That's another question. But if you look at the historical reality of it, up till now, you realize that the link between your legal system and your economic growth is not directly correlated. To say it differently, if you need sound institution at one point, it doesn't mean that there's only one framework that functions. Okay, and so the relationship between your institutions and its effect on growth has to be looked into with much more scrutiny. Okay, it's not that simple. And if we look at the long-term, take a long-term vision of economic growth and legal systems. Okay, there's a question, a very relevant question. Could you please elaborate on why Japan and Korea are examples of legal systems that do not live up to the rule of law ideal? Let me be more precise. They definitely do now, today, but their economic growth that brought them to a rule of law ideal today, which basically, and I will bring it to very simple elements, less political than I would say mechanical. Transparency, accountability. Okay, those are the kind of elements. Securing freedom, because by securing freedom and property rights, you enable innovation, you enable entrepreneurship and things like that. So those would be the elements of the rule of law that I see, rather than the link that was made in the past between basically democracy and development. And that was a very short-sighted view. There was this idea, but that is very wrong, that you needed democracy to develop. Okay, that is wrong for two reasons. One is because it's like capitalism. There is not one democracy model. Okay, there's not one democratic model. There are basic requirements, obviously, but for example, India, which is the largest democracy in the world, doesn't practice its democracy the same way we would do in France, for example. Okay, so it was wrong to think that by just saying I'm creating democratic institutions, I'm going to have growth. That was a mistake. The other reason why it was wrong is that historically, you see how development is not linked, and immediate growth is not linked to these democratic institutions. Where the link becomes probably closer is what we call the sustainability of your model. There's a lot of economists and you know, political philosophers and lawyers that are working on this today. One of the general ideas that appears is that rapid and intensive growth doesn't require as a precondition a specific set of political institutions, does require institutional arrangement that enable development, and those political systems and the institutional arrangement that you then need, once you've developed to a certain extent, that you need to have a sustainable model probably do change. So to say it differently, and I'm coming back to the South Korea example, because South Korea is a very, very good example. Japan would be also. But South Korea is a very good example. And I know that probably many of you are quite familiar with South Korea and South Koreans, since they're very close industrial commercial ties between Vietnam and South Korea. But South Korea is a very good example. It developed with a very authoritarian, it was a dictatorship initially, model that focused on state planification. It had these 5-year plans that were very stable for a long time, investing in education, in industrialization, and in research, for example. And that they started that in the late 1950s, well, the 1960s. Okay. This brought a certain development. And only after a certain time did they gradually move towards a different political system in order to have sustainability and stability of society. To give you a counterexample, it is often said, although it was not the mainstream story, but if you look at the revolutions in the early 2010, 2011, all that, in the Arab world, it is often said that, it's not often said. If you look at it more technically, you realize that the models, that the political systems that existed at that point were not contested because there was enough redistribution. The models actually collapsed because of the financial crisis. And because of the financial crisis, the redistribution just didn't function anymore. And that is when the people rejected the model. And that's when you had the revolutions. So my point here is just to show that historically, if you look at the relationship between law and development, you realize that the type of relationship between your institutions and your development is probably of a different nature than the relationship that you then need once you have developed at a certain point with institutions that enable you to have a sustained development. Two different things, okay? Two very, very different things. And that could explain why, for example, a country like China will not see its political, or they will not see any demand for an internal change of the political system, for a very simple reason. They have 1.4 billion inhabitants, okay, or citizens. Among those 1.4 billion Chinese people, only a small portion has benefited from the strong economic development of the last 20 to 30 years. Meaning that the model hasn't yet, if you take China as a whole, hasn't yet created a well-distributed and an equally beneficial system for all of the population. So there is no demand for a change, because they are still in a phase of emergence in terms of development. South Korea, by the 1990s, was different. They had achieved this level where the redistribution basically covered, of course I'm talking in generalities, basically covered, there were obviously exceptions, there are poor people in South Korea, but the majority of the people in South Korea had benefited from this rapid growth, had access to education, and so could contemplate a different life. And that is probably one of the reasons why at one point there is a national demand, so the people will demand a different political system where they have a greater say in how things are run. So that is why my point here is just to highlight the fact that the relationship between rule of law, the way it was carried out by international organizations from the 1960s up till, let's say, the early 2000, after the financial crisis, 2010, was resting on a probably imperfect assumption and correlation. And today's world, because of the multipolar world that we live in, we realize that they do play an important role, but the sequencing is not the same. And that is something that Niall Ferguson touches upon, and he was talking there in 2011. I think the talk is in 2011 or something like that, so 10 years ago, but it remains relevant. But he was touching about the sequencing. I think this is one of the interesting thing about today, is that we realize that we see why these killer apps are necessary. We see why these institutions play a role, but we also know that the institutional mix and the sequencing of that mix doesn't follow just one unique pass, and there are different ways of moving forward. And so that's why this chart here that you see on the screen shows exactly that. If you take starting 1500, and this is maybe not the best proxy. I mean, GDP doesn't explain, I would say, sufficiently the development or the industrialization of a country, but it is useful in order to at least give an idea of the economic power and the economic dynamism of a country. So if we take, so even if it's probably a debatable indicator, let's use it, because it does relate to at least an aggregate economical reality. So the share of world GDP, 1500, what we call today the developed or the industrialized world. The US didn't exist, okay? So they account for nothing. The UK for one, which is a lot for what it is, but just for one. The rest of Western Europe, 17. Canada, Australia, they didn't exist really then. At the same time, you take China, India, and the rest of Asia, and it's more than 60% of the world GDP. So this gives an idea. I mean, in 1500, what we call today the emerging world was over 78%, so including Russia and Africa, but maybe I'll set Africa aside, because Africa is a continent in itself that has a complex past. But if you take just these major, so what we call other Asia basically Southeast Asia, so that would include Vietnam, India and China. They're the major players. They are the dominant players. And intellectually, in terms of ideas, in terms of circulation of ideas, these are the dominant players. Europe, which is a very diversified area, accounts for much less. Okay. Now, if you jump 300 years later, okay, 400 years later, then you see an inversion of that. Okay, and if you take the 1970s, for example, which is what Niall Ferguson was talking about, this is the period where what is called the industrialized world does dominate, of course, the share of world GDP, where China and India and the rest of Asia really collapses in terms of share of GDP. Now, why is this interesting and very, very insightful? It's interesting because, first of all, and I would say that there are two elements that come out of this. First of all, these different regions or countries do not have the same legal system, and we see that they experience different growth paths. So this clearly points out to the fact that even though laws and institutions do play a role, there is probably not just one set of institutions that can favor development. It also means that your legal origins, your legal system, your legal tradition is not a very useful explanation to your growth. What could be said is that some kind of convergence on these legal institutions, and that happens at the end of the 20th century, early 21st century, might explain partially for the emergence and a rebalancing of the different economic players in the world. And the fact that we are, in a certain sense, moving toward the world that has, at least in a much less clear view, that doesn't really have one dominant group. Okay, so that might be, but this is just a hypothesis. Okay, I'm not saying that's how you should understand things. I'm just giving you that for to think about it. Okay, it might explain. But what is quite certain, though, is that this clearly points out to the fact that you cannot say that there's a direct correlation between a given legal system or legal tradition, and that your system is not the only element that account for your development. Because otherwise, why do some nations collapse at one point? Okay. So this is the same idea, except it goes up to 2008. It's just the charts. In blue, China. In pale blue, India. Then you have here Japan in the middle, UK, France, and Germany here, and the US down here. So it shows how there is no linear development. All right, meaning that institutions, to be efficient, they do have, and I think this is one of the lessons I think that is very important. Your institutions, to be efficient, also have to correspond to the human group and to the geographical area that you're considering. Brings me back to the question that I talked about earlier, the famous legal transplant. It really shows how you cannot transplant legal institutions from one area, one culture to another and have the same output. Okay, you need adaptations, you need to contextualize. And this is something we'll see when we talk about business ethics, compliance, corporate governance. We will see why, although mastering the concept requires also to understand how they function, to see that in a different context, they will play out differently. Okay, and that will be part of what we'll be looking at, and I'm very eager to insist upon, because I think that that's an important element to understand the world that we live in and the world that we will be living in, and that you and I, well, more you, because I'm not at the start of my career, so I'll have less impact in the coming year than your generation will. How you, by understanding this, can probably be more efficient in bringing out tomorrow's world. So very quickly, just to finish this on, because I think there was we've already said a lot, and you probably, I assume, be starting to tire a bit. Just to finish on this law and development, we've seen that the major arguments and elements. Maybe just to say that there is and that's what's important, there is a rolling relationship between law and markets. What I mean by that is that law is not an endowment. Now, you know the term endowment. An endowment is when, for example, you have fixed capital that that produces revenues because it serves an interest. And so an endowment will provide a very firm foundation for growth. An endowment for a company is that it has a very important capital, so they can mobilize these resources. Okay. Now, law is not an endowment. It is not because you reach a certain level of efficiency with your institutions, with your legal system, that it cannot fail at one point, that it cannot, as it was delivering well up to a certain extent, suddenly it doesn't deliver as well. So what we have to understand is that the development of a capitalist system, and once again, I mean, since the demise of the USSR, there is but one single global system, which is open markets and competitive markets. But within that unique system, there are so many differences, okay, that you can do comparative capitalism today. You can compare the different organization, although there is one economic underlying theory. And this is being debated today, of course, again, in the wake of the crisis and in the wake of the financial crisis plus the pandemic. So what we have to understand is that your capitalist systems, it builds upon what is called creative destruction. And we know Schumpeter's view on creative destructions, you know, new technology destroys jobs, but creates new jobs. That's the idea. My point is that we should apply this. We have to have the same understanding of governance structures, so of institutions. Governance structures of all type, and we will see that when we talk about governance structures, we're talking about law, hard law, soft law, and other types of mechanism. They have to adapt and to respond to changes. Okay, that is true in the sphere and in the realm of economics, but it's true also in the realm of society. And I think this is what has to be understood. And that's why when we look at the latest development in compliance and ethics, this is exactly what it is. The development of ethics and compliance is a answer of governance structures to today's world. All right. So it's an evolution from the past 30 or 40 or 50 years in itself. And so what you really have to understand is that there is a rolling relationship between law and markets. There is one. But first of all, we haven't yet really well understood how it functions, or at least we haven't identified one cause. Okay. And secondly, it's a changing relationship over time. So it's a dynamic relationship. In the following slides, and I'm not going to go into detail tonight because it's enough, but it's another way to look at the different legal systems. Instead of looking what we've done in the past at the legal families, the legal tradition, it's to look in a much more, let's say, operational way. It's to look at what legal systems, what are they composed of, and to see that there are different institutional mix that can be efficient. And the three-sided classification of the legal system actually focuses on the way it is organized. Is it centralized or decentralized? And we'll see example of that later on. What are the main functions that your legal system is delivering? Okay, in terms of market-oriented activities. And what is finally the political economy? Because the legal systems are not politically neutral systems. They are, of course, related to the political system. So if you take these three elements and you try to classify the actual institutional arrangement that you find in different states, you realize that you have different mix that can deliver efficiently or inefficiently. Okay, and it is not because of the mix. So that means that the explanation of the economic growth cannot be only rooted in that policy mix. But what you do find then, if you look at the long term, you realize, if you took a long-term view of that development, you do realize that there is a link between some of these policy mix and the sustainability of a system, of an efficient system. And so that's what we'll be looking at basically in the background of our talks that will be much more technical in the following elements. And so tomorrow, when we meet again, I'll start on the I'm coming back on the international convergence of financial regulation, because that's a very good example of how there has been some kind of convergence and how it delivers differently in different parts of the world, and how it has set the background for the development of compliance and then of business ethics in the last decade since the financial crisis. All right, so if there are no questions at this point, but I understand that it's a lot of information tonight that's quite abstract. You have the slides. I'll make sure you get the following slides presentation for the class early enough, and I'll post a message also telling you when and what cases we'll be looking at, so you can read them in advance. See some people trying to write. Oh, there's a question regarding should we watch any videos in advance. I'll probably send you some extra videos, but I think that some of the videos we should watch together, most of them are shorter than the one we just saw, because they illustrate parts of the talk. So we'll be watching them, but I will send you some other ones that might be a bit longer that you might want to watch by yourself when you have time or in advance. I'll do that. I'll send you the list like this if you want to take that into advance. And if you want to start watching the Enron documentary, yes, of course, that would make sense, because like this, if you have any questions, we can talk about them during the sessions. Okay, so I'll also post on the Canvas platform. I'll also post a list of the videos and the links that enabled you to watch those videos. All right, I think it's well, it is. It's already it's just about 9 o'clock for you, so I guess it's time to call it a day. So, well, terribly sorry not to be able to interact directly, but I'm saying good night, and see you not tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow. Have a great night.